dear, beloved oldest child. But I feel like I'm preaching to the converted. You guys are awesome. What's up there now? Oh, okay. When I was asked to speak today, I completely forgot that spring is upon us. April and May are always difficult months for me. In fact, spring is difficult for those of us who live with bipolar disorder. Spring light is strong, and with daylight savings, it's longer. We're shoved out of our winter routines and rituals. Paranoia is no longer lurking outside of my drawn curtains, but with the light, I throw my curtains open, and paranoia enters my home once again. These quiet changes make life more stressful, especially because I don't allow my fear to be seen. I've had a lifetime of practice, a lifetime to perfect my outward appearance. But I am grateful to be here with all of you, fear or not, because we all need to be cognizant of and understand mental illness and the challenges that face our community and state. Now, if I see one more photo of a man holding a trout, I think I'll scream. Why do men think they look attractive behind fish? I wasn't lonely until I subscribed to a dating site a couple of years ago. I was obsessed with checking the site over and over for the message from a stranger. I wasted hours perusing the pages, looking for that one face who could possibly be the answer to the new feeling of loneliness. And how many dates would it take to find that magical man of my imagination? Perhaps imagination is the key word. Anyway, there I was, sitting across a somewhat sticky table from a 73-year-old man. I could tell that he used to be a very good-looking man. His nose was perfect. His teeth were his own, but old. He wasn't bald, but what was left on his head was white and brushed to the side. He had a small growth on his right eyelid. I couldn't stop staring at it and wondered if it was removable. We had found each other on the dating site. I had decided to inquire after older men. He was 11 years older than me, because they are retired and have a ton of time on their hands. Perhaps I was wrong to go that route. Perhaps I should have reined in my age requirements. This was the second fellow I met. The first was 68, and he talked almost non-stop for 45 minutes. I had to stand and tell him I was leaving before he took a breath. He was a widower, and his requirements for a relationship were dominated by his dead wife. He wanted nothing intimate. His wife had been his best friend for 41 years, and he still wore his wedding ring. I decided to stick with divorced men. But then there was the divorced man who asked online, where are all the regular women? Are there any women left who haven't been married 5 times? Well, that surprised me, because I have been married 5 times, and I didn't realize there were so many of us. Have any of you been married 5 times? Put up your hand. I wondered why I was doing this. I was diagnosed with depression in the early 80s, then diagnosed with bipolar disorder in the late 90s. Then I was finally properly diagnosed with bipolar 1 disorder with psychotic features and a tendency to rapid cycle and a proclivity for a mixed state in a hospital near Boston. I had a husband then, but in 2004 he decided he couldn't do our marriage anymore. It takes more than popping pills to recover from a mental illness, and he had no faith that I would get better. I really don't blame him, and we have become great friends. But back then, I had no choice but to plod along inside my recovery. I have developed life-challenging allergies to 2 medications. First was Tegretol, that almost threw me into Stevens-Johnson syndrome. I was saved by a dermatologist who saw the pustules all over my body and immediately recognized them as an allergy to Tegretol. I still have the scars. Next was Geodone. The reaction to Geodone almost killed me, and I will always be grateful to Dr. Kirchhoff, who ran a certain blood test as I lay in the hospital, my muscles melting. My heart would have been next. She saved my life. Between suicide attempts and medication allergies, I am very, very fortunate to be alive. Why have I persisted with medication? Because without it, I most certainly would have killed myself. Why did I care about staying alive? Because of my 3 children. I read an article the other day about mothers who were suicidal who decided to stay alive for their children. I don't know why, but I thought I was the only one. Medications have side effects, and the one I disliked the most is weight gain. I truly believed that I couldn't lose weight, that weight was something that came with psychiatric medication, which it does, and there's nothing we can do about it. Wrong. My late night forays to the refrigerator were my downfall, sometimes twice a night. I take clozapine before bedtime, and the hunger this antipsychotic medication creates is something fierce. But instead of calming the hunger with ice cream, I now arm myself with fruit. Instead of eating hamburgers and fries, I fill up on vegetables. I know how boring this sounds, but my blood showed I was close to diabetes, and I'm terrified of shots. So I said to myself, this is ridiculous, and took the path of boring food. I won't look like I used to before I was treated, ever again. But I do mourn for the small woman I used to be. There's a size 8 pair of jeans hanging on the wall in my office. These jeans are covered with sequins and represent my previous wildness. I look at them every day, and I hope I can get back into them at some point. And I promise not to be as wild as I was when I wore them. I have lived with bipolar disorder my whole life. I did, looking back, have symptoms before the psychosis that happened in my early 20s. I medicated myself with drugs and alcohol until I came close to killing myself for the 3rd time in 2001. I found AA that year and have been clean and sober for 17 years and 3 months. But even clean and sober, my episodes of depression and mania, accompanied by suicidal ideation, continued. I can mourn now for the out-of-control me, the me who tried to kill herself at 16 and then again at 19, who destroyed everything good in my life with the highs and lows, the confusion and grief I felt after a destructive manic episode, usually sending a husband or lover running, and the just got through it by the skin of my teeth after a dangerous depressive episode. I'd thought about each method of killing myself in intimate detail going over each scenario repeatedly, carefully refining each step. I could see myself raising a pistol to my mouth and squeezing the trigger, leaning into a shotgun and squeezing the trigger, lowering myself into the freezing creek that ran by my house or floating dead in the lake. Each time I conjured one of these images, the act seemed less frightening, even comforting. I reached the point where the idea of killing myself seemed inevitable. This suicide scenario was contrasted with the manic me, the push-up bra and white t-shirt me that always got my way. Oh, sorry. I have hearing aids on and my phone's ringing and it's I was surfing channels the other night and came across a 1961 black and white film starring Joan Crawford. The title was Straitjacket, 2 words that immediately piqued my curiosity. I watched, my hands clenched to the end. The writers obviously had no compassion for the mentally ill, but they wouldn't back then. Stigma is still alive in 2018, but just think how it was in 1961, 50 years ago. I was 8 years old when that film was shot. Now, 57 years later, I try to fit my present thinking into something as old-fashioned as straitjacket. The mentally ill were still kept behind closed doors. I imagine those doors closing with a bang and a rattle, the heavy-footed attendant walking away. Thanks to Mental Health America, the chains from many asylums, chains that were used to hold us, were melted down to make their freedom bell. I give myself chills just thinking about the chains that made that bell. More chills when I imagine myself and my son sitting in our filth, no medication on board, forgotten by the world. Isn't it curious that the word asylum means refuge, sanctuary? We, the mentally ill, were kept hidden by the world. We were subjected to terrible abuse, to filthy wards and indifferent staff. We were subjected to lobotomies and painful shock treatments, unlike the ECT treatments of today. We were an embarrassment, a dirty secret to our families, our country, and our government. I had a friend I met in AA who was born along with his brother who was schizophrenic in the 1920s. His brother was given a lobotomy in the 40s and sent home, where he sat in a corner smoking cigarettes until he died of lung cancer. During the late 60s and early 70s, reduction of corporate taxes was pursued with renewed vigor. In order to reduce corporate taxes, it was necessary to reduce the size of the welfare state. Among the policies in need of reform to suit the corporate agenda were those that affected the mentally ill. In 1961, the same year that produced Straitjacket, the Joint Commission on Mental Illness released Action for Mental Illness and Health, calling for the integration of the mentally ill into the general public with the aid of community mental health centers. The mental health centers were never built. Hundreds of hospitals for the mentally ill were emptied with nowhere for the patients to go. The government in the 60s complained about the Vietnam War was draining their coffers. The government then and the government now seem parallel in their dedication to not helping the mentally ill. All sorts of excuses have been waved around. The Vietnam War, the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, and it's the soldiers who fought in these wars who need help. We have created many more mentally ill with war and now we're pushed to the wall to take care of these men and women. It sickens me that corporate America gets to lower their taxes, and because of the indifference to mental illness, clinics are not built. This recipe for disaster happened in 1961 and is happening now in 2018. If the community mental health centers had been built, I dare say we would not have such a huge population of homeless on our streets. This should break your heart and fuel your opposition to a government that simply doesn't care. My second husband, James Thompson, was one Vietnam vet who did commit suicide. It's been told that more men from the Vietnam War have committed suicide than who died over there. And that number is 58,220. We're seeing the same phenomenon in our vets from our current wars. Suicide is the result of untreated and undertreated serious mental illness. PTSD, bipolar disorder, schizoaffective disorder, schizophrenia, major depression, and traumatic brain injury, illnesses that originate in our brains but attack our bodies with symptoms that ravage our souls. When untreated bipolar disorder was destroying my life, I felt that the only way to get better, the only way to be released, was to kill myself. I believed completely that my family would be better off without me. Suicide makes the living very uncomfortable, but suicide is a way of dying that is the direct result of mental illness. Suicide is to mental illness what a tumor is to cancer. Say that over and over to yourself and let it sink in. My eldest son, Calen. I gave my eldest son, Calen, something no one would ever want to give their child. I passed him the mutated DNA that caused him to develop schizophrenia. He was admitted to a hospital near Boston at age 19. At that time, I didn't know much about DNA and mutations. I thought I had damaged Calen, that the divorce between his father and I and my drinking had caused him to spiral down into this terrible state. I basically knew nothing about the internal workings of mental illness. During the time Calen was at the hospital, my bipolar illness became much worse. I lost yet another husband because I was cycling very fast and had become delusional. I would sit in my armchair and wait for Calen to show up in his gray truck. In my addled brain, he would jump out and rush to the house and give me a big hug and tell me this was all a nightmare. I would sit as though paralyzed and run that scenario over and over in my mind. I would receive calls from Calen from the hospital begging me to let him come home. These calls became chronic, and I think because I didn't know how to handle him on the phone, they damaged both of us. This just couldn't be happening to my firstborn, not to the beautiful, charming, laughing, and independent boy his father and I raised. He's still pretty good looking. I began to not be able to take out the garbage or even get in the car to buy groceries without an enormous mental push. My youngest child, my daughter, 10 years younger than Calen, needed my care. And because I took that responsibility seriously, I pushed myself to the limit. I pray I never have to do that again. Now, to digress again, my great uncle was a lunatic. I like that word. It carries a heavy load of stigma, but I like how ancient it is. The origin from Old French lunatique, from Latin luna, meaning moon, from the belief that changes in the moon cause intermittent insanity. Now, I don't know about you, but I have definitely felt the pull of the moon. I have stood outside on a warm summer night and stared up at that orb. I have felt the power of its light falling on me. Even in winter, I feel the full moon before seeing it creep out from behind snow clouds. My great uncle was, quoting a great aunt, not right in his mind. His antics were legendary and dismissed with a laugh. The most tenacious story involving Uncle is that he would strip naked in the stables, hop astride a horse, and ride over the hills of Greenwich, Connecticut. I suspect the moon was full when he did this, and I suspect he was experiencing full-blown mania. The chauffeur would saddle up and ride after Uncle, catch him and take him to Bloomingdale Sanitarium in New York. The romanticism of this stunt overrides the inevitable conclusion that Uncle was manic. Whether he was bipolar or not rests with history. He was my maternal grandmother's eldest brother, and his is the story of obvious mental illness that dates back as far as we know. But crazy is as crazy does. Uncle sold all his stock just days before the big crash in 1929. And when he died, he left his 3 sisters with plenty of money. One of his sisters, my grandmother, suffered from depression. Her symptoms began with staring off into space. Not contemplative staring, just staring. I inherited the staring, and when I catch myself, I am always afraid. Okay, it's now 1976, New York at the Democratic National Convention. Mrs. Carter doesn't remember this, but I do. I was a young assistant reporter and was given an assignment to meet Rosalind, Amy, and Lillian on the curb outside the convention hall doors. We were to ride around the park in a horse-drawn carriage while I interviewed them. But being in a manic phase during the convention, I drank so much tequila and snorted so much cocaine the night before that I couldn't get out of bed the next morning. I gave my amends to Mrs. Carter years ago, but I destroyed my budding career in journalism as surely as I left the soon-to-be first family standing on the curb. Did this slow my use of alcohol and drugs? No. It would take me 25 more years to get sober. It's now 1998. The town car was black. My sister Glenn found me at the Salt Lake airport, introduced me to the driver, long, curly, shiny hair, his silent back in the driver's seat, us behind. My craziness was to be certified or not. First stop, the Psychiatric Institute, then on to the Neurological Center. I was finally on my way to figure out how to stay alive, but I didn't find it promising to see a graveyard right next to the Institute. The psychiatrist sat very far away in his chair, me on the couch. He told me that if I'd been able to do anything about how I am, I would have. He told me I wasn't stupid. In fact, I was quite intelligent, which was typical of my disorder. Well, that's just great, I told him. But I had to call my neighbor the other day to take my shotgun away. I just know the feeling of warm blood on my body would heal me from my pain. He looked at me for a long minute, then said, "We can help you with medication. We'll start you on something to calm your mania, then introduce something to help your depression, But, he said, you may feel quite tired and heavy for a while. Is there someone who can help you for a few weeks? No, I have a young child and I live in the mountains with her. I lived in McAllister at that time, near Ennis. Oh, well, you'll manage. Brittle words. I'll write you a few prescriptions, and I advise you to find a psychiatrist up in Montana. Now that I know more about bipolar disorder, I'm stunned that this doctor didn't pick up on the psychotic piece. I gave him several more examples, symptoms that were obviously psychotic, but he didn't see it, and I didn't know. I was 45 years old. My daughter Maddie was 7. My sons were at boarding school. I was convinced that the doctor was trying to poison me. But a friend, Susie, told me to just shut the fuck up and take the pills. I began taking the prescribed medication. After all, the neurologist had told me that his test showed I had a very orderly brain and no tumor, which is what my family was afraid of, maybe. A tumor was a tangible reason, something that could be seen. Serious mental illness was not yet part of the conversation, but now it was. These 2 medications didn't cut it. I continued being manic and depressed and thought that the small relief I found was about as good as it was going to get. And being an alcoholic, I discovered early on that the medications allowed me to get drunk with fewer drinks. Always a plus for a drunk on a budget. But I still thought the doctor was trying to poison me. I told him my fears of poison again, and he told me he couldn't speak to me anymore until I dropped this absurd idea. Small and white in my palm, not something I want to swallow anymore. I take one more, thinking secretly, I'll simply not fill the next prescription. It's all poison anyway. Poison to keep me in order, keep words out of my mouth and away from my fingertips, keep me working and paying the bills. I'll forget taking this one, and that doesn't match the others anyway, round and tasteless as it is, dissolving too quickly on my tongue. The others smooth, that stick easily to my lips when I bend my head into my hand to eat them. No one sees me not refill the bottle. No one suspects I'll wean myself off them, all the chemicals that keep me doing as I should. But I did keep taking them for my 2 sons and my daughter, not me. 1998 was a hellish year. It was the spring of '98 that saw my eldest son, Calen, spiral down into severe mental illness. I have seen up front and close how certain people in the mental health field support the stigma of mental illness. I had no idea what was going on with Calen, so I took him to a counselor in our town of Bozeman. This counselor was not a psychiatrist or a psychologist, and I'm afraid he only exacerbated the situation by telling me that Calen needed to go on a personal discovery quest in the woods. How Montana of him. Thank God I didn't listen to the quest part, but I did listen to the difficult teenager part. Calen is my eldest child, and I had absolutely no idea what was going on. If only I'd known some of the warning signs, like suspicion of others, agitated behavior, withdrawal from social situations, deviation from normal routines and beliefs. All I knew was that Calen wasn't Calen anymore, and I never put 2 and 2 together as far as my own mental illness. That mental illness can and is passed from generation to generation. I don't think we are capable of seeing what is causing our children's pain. We don't want anything terrible to happen, so we put on blinders. I have a dear friend who finally took my blinders off. Pam had studied, among other things, psychology when in college. She came over one afternoon and observed Calen, who was sitting on the couch, feet flat on the floor, elbows on knees, rocking ever so slightly. She began speaking to him and then listened very carefully to what he was saying. She noticed that his pupils were huge. His words made no sense, even though they had a normal tone. He began telling her about the people who were spying on him, who pretended to innocently walk past the house. He told her about the antenna on the roof that was keeping track of him. He didn't say these things in front of me. Pam had asked me to leave the room. Then, when she called me back in, I could see that Calen had been crying, and he revealed how frightened he was. Pam told me she thought Calen had schizophrenia. I did not absorb that fact. But because of Pam, we sought help from a psychiatrist as fast as we could. Calen was put on Zyprexa. It didn't work. He asked to try naturopathic medications. Those really didn't work. It became evident in a short period of time that Calen needed in-house care. After much searching, we settled on the hospital outside of Boston. I took him, and as I was leaving him there, driving away in a cab, I couldn't stop crying, especially since he ran out of the building where he was staying and yelled his goodbyes, jumping and shouting and running next to the cab. I should have been dropping him off at college. Grief, grief, grief. Grief wouldn't leave me for a very long time. Grief that exacerbates my own symptoms. I think I'm back in the world I'm supposed to be in, but I look at the clock on my stove and I see it's 1:11 again. Always 1:11 or 11:11 or 3:33 or 2:22, but mostly 1:11 or 11:11. What's going on? Why do I feel compelled to look at the clock and see these numbers? Calen sees them too. And I remember when he first got sick and I wanted to believe he really was from another world, or another world was communicating with him, because that's what he said. Maybe it's true. I came to believe it wasn't true, but now it's happening to me with these numbers. There's an 11 in this house number, along with a 3, which is usually in the numbers that are important to me. I live one house down from 1111 and wonder if I should have bought that house instead of 1103. I saw 111 just now and yelled, put my head between my hands and shook it. If I can't come back this time, I at least want to know what's going on. I found myself faced with death, with suicide in 2001. It was the faces of my 3 children, Calen, Sander, and Maddie, who kept me from actually picking up the revolver that was there behind the truck door that dark New Year's night. It was then, New Year's 2001, that I knew I had to stop drinking or I would die and scar my children forever. As much as I didn't want to keep living, struggling, suffering, I knew my death would be the defining act of my children's lives. The year 2001 saw me in many AA meetings. I would leave Maddie with her little dog, Wing Ding, and an old family dog, Joey, who she was convinced would take care of her while I was in a meeting. Perhaps my judgment wasn't so great, but I did stick with the program. But even clean and sober, my episodes of depression and mania accompanied, even without the booze, by suicidal ideation continued. Thanks to the concern and generosity of my family, I was properly diagnosed, which means the psychotic piece and my tendency to a mixed state and rapid cycling was finally addressed at the hospital in 2004. I was 50. When I sobered up, I didn't know just how big a favor I was doing for myself. My doctor at the hospital told me he wouldn't have been able to diagnose me properly if I was still drinking. He also mentioned that alcoholism is a form of mental illness. Before I was properly diagnosed in 2004 and given the right medications, I left a flattened path of houses, cars, and husbands in my wake. I honestly don't know how many cars I've traded in. Once I learned about the balloon payments, I was all over it. Houses were more trouble to get ready, and inevitably, once they were cleaned up and ready for the marketplace, my mood would change and I'd want to stay. Unfortunately, the realtors wouldn't see it that way. I moved Maddie and me 12 times in 8 years. But husbands were the most trouble. As I said, I went through 5. It's easier to keep count of husbands. I really am grateful now to live with only my 4 dogs. Any correlation you may make is strictly yours. I speak of these husbands to illustrate how difficult it is for those who are not mentally ill to truly understand those of us who are, and why they should attend local NAMI support meetings. My 5th and last husband, one of the 2 remaining ones, would tell me to my face, "I want you back." What he meant was that he wanted my mania back, or at least those few days I would enjoy being steady between mania and depression. Just please bring back that person I love because I can't stand the depressed, suicidal one. I remember pounding him on his chest with my fists, saying, "I'm right here, this is me too." The manic me spoiled him. He loved the hypersexual, happy person who greeted him at the end of the day. He didn't like the scared, depressed wife who would crawl into our closet to hide, lying on our shoes. He felt helpless in the face of the empty shell of his wife who sat, staring at nothing for days on end. He wasn't able to understand my dark side, and actually only wanted the beginnings of mania, not the end part, when I became irritable, angry, and mean. I encouraged him to regularly attend NAMI support meetings, but he wouldn't. I must say that I think going to NAMI meetings to support a loved one with a mental illness should be prescribed along with that loved one's medication. It is possible to love, even when you're suffering. I remember my psychologist at the hospital asking me, "You know, don't you, that sleeping only 2 hours at night isn't normal?" Well, yes, of course I knew that, but living at night is what I did for probably 35 years. One of my favorite memories still is drawing and writing until the sun came up, a glass of wine at my elbow. In fact, doing just about anything, as long as the rest of the world was asleep, was how I liked it. I was drawn to the night for the quiet, for the lack of confusion. It's possible to physically feel the quiet at night. When I came home in 2004 from the hospital, I began the process of fitting into the world of light and daytime, of changing my sleep patterns, and most importantly to me, how to write during the day. My therapist made me promise that I'd turn out the light at 1 a.m. So in the beginning, I'd turn out my light at one, then turn it right back on. He would ask me if I'd stuck to my promise, and I could honestly say yes. But now, 13 years later, not only do I not manipulate my environment and my therapist, I take my medications at 8, am ready for sleep around 10, unless there's a full moon, which we won't go into more of that, and go to bed shortly thereafter, and I can write during the day. There's a mourning period we go through with ourselves and our loved ones. I can say I went through a mourning period about myself. I missed the wild me, the manic me in the beginning, but not anymore. I mourned the loss of Calen as he was, but not anymore. We're both just how we're meant to be, and all this is possible because of our family and our own hard work and modern medications. I believe that for us who do have a mental illness, we have a responsibility to help our fellow sufferers. My son and I are incredibly fortunate to be born into a family who was able to get us care. That doesn't mean there's a magic wand out there. Getting and staying well is very much our own responsibility. But we were given a considerable head start, and that is something I do not take for granted. Being an advocate is the role I have adopted for myself to give back. But even in that role, I experience stigma and self-stigma. The looks I get at times when I announce to practice bravery that I live with a mental illness are scary. I still get scared to tell on myself. I still get butterflies in my stomach when I discuss my disorder. Perhaps this will always be so. But the line we cross is a line that we can help fade. We simply need to keep talking, no matter how frightening that is. In closing, I have to cite a battle cry from Winston Churchill. He said, "The only way through hell is to keep going." Dealing with a mental illness is like going through hell. Family may not be able to help, which is hell. Not having the right help is going through hell. Your government, our government, may not be able to help, which is hell. Returning from war and ending up on the streets is hell. We don't need hell on this earth. There are some in our country who believe we, the mentally ill, need to pull ourselves up by our bootstraps. Being psychotic and depressed for as long as I was, I can tell you simply, I could not have done that. Having a mental illness is already difficult. I hope all of you are here to champion mental health and sobriety, as I know you all are. Please reach out to those who are living with mental illness, as you do. I hope that if you know someone who is struggling, that you'll let them know you're there to help. And if you yourself are struggling, please tell someone and get help. My sister Glenn, who is sitting here with us, made a dream come true for Calen and me. She co-founded our organization, BringChangeToMind.org, in 2009. In the 9 years since Bring Change to Mind was founded, I've seen many new organizations pop up and fight the stigma that we, the mentally ill, experience from a public who is prejudiced against us. If you need a tool to help others, or if you live with a mental illness and want to share with others, please go to our site. I thank you for that. Let's keep going and turn our hell into a little bit of heaven. And vote for Kathleen Williams!